Looks like we're rolling here. Welcome to painting a Picasso portrait. Hopefully, if you want to, grab your paints, paint along with me. Saturday painting day. I'm just gonna start off by I'm going for a portrait. You know, we're going for I'm using Dora Maar portrait as a reference. So if you want to bring up some reference imagery, you can look at some portraits of Dora Maar. But I'm just going to start off by mixing up a little bit of cad red and black on my palette and thin that down a little bit just to go with the sketching phase of the painting to begin with. And we're going to sketch this in and then bang in all these different parts as we go along. You can see in the top right corner, I just have an old video because, you know, we need more stimulation in these videos, I think, right? We need to be able to see a little bit more than just me painting. Just me painting and a video of me painting. How about that? So I'm starting off with this box. You know, when you're working with a smaller canvas, this is actually masonite, but generally when you're working with a smaller canvas, you're going to want to instinctively, I think people want to make the head as big as their canvas when it's small, because we have this kind of instinctual need to think about portraits that we create being the same size as people that we see in real life all the time. And our brain actually has a whole processing center based on recognition. It's kind of interesting because some people have problems with this, you know, recognition center of the brain, and they will not be able to recognize people. They can see fine. They can, you know, navigate the world completely normally. But when they look at people, they don't recognize actually who they are. So we're going to begin in the sketching phase and think about a person. You know, I think it's important to think about a person when we're creating these. And I've just got a small brush at this point with some thinned down red and black oil paint, cadmium red, ivory black, with a little bit of cad yellow in it. And I just thinned it down a little bit to make it more conducive to painting. And we can just sketch in our outline based upon our person that we're looking at. In this case, my wife. Who else, right? But we want to sketch out the person that we're looking at, and we're going to think about multiple viewpoints. So Picasso is often thinking about looking straight onto an image and sideways onto an image, and, you know, all these different viewpoints. That's what Cubism is about. So we're thinking about Picasso in the 1930s at this point. But he takes this approach all the time. You can see it in his drawings early on. You can see it later on in his paintings and drawings as well. But of course, the portraits of Dora Maar are the most recognizable of the kind of goofy paintings where, you know, the nose is on the side of the head and the eyes are on the front of the head. So get your source imagery in front of you and start looking at that image and start thinking about, you know, what would the side of that nose look like? Maybe take multiple images. That's actually a really good idea I should have done, is to just take multiple images of the person that you're painting. You know, just kind of take an image of them straight on, take an image of them from the side, 3/4, you know, the other side, and so forth. And then you have this kind of 360 view of the person that you're painting. And Picasso was looking at people in this manner. And a lot of this had to do with, I mean, we could go far into it in terms of physics and the theory of relativity and all these sort of things. I wouldn't be able to explain that. But there are books that are, you know, go into this much more in depth than I could. But a lot of what science was looking at the time was also these kind of multiple perspectives of reality and thinking about perception. How do we perceive the world? We perceive it in a way that is put together in our brains by our eyes. And so we also perceive it in a way that's framed by the culture that we're brought up in. It's framed by the experiences that we've had. So certain situations may appear completely different to some people as compared to others based on where they're from, based on the experiences they've gone through. Sometimes very small, what would you call it? When somebody does something to you that's very, very small, it can elicit a really strong reaction. And we're never really sure, you might be messing with a crazy person, right? So all of us have different perspectives. It's not good to call them crazy, by the way, but all of us have different perspectives, and we come to certain situations completely on different terms. And so when we're looking at the different perspectives of a person, we can think about physically, how do we see that person from the side? How do we see that person from the front? How do we see that person from the back? What do their ears look like? And this goes back to Egyptian painting as well. So when we're thinking about Egyptian painting, we're looking at around 3000 BC. And, of course, they would make the shoulders straight, and then the head would be sideways, right? So we have a long, long history. Painting goes back tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of years. Check out my cave painting podcast, the painting podcast it's called. I have one that I just made on cave painting, if you want to dig into that more, just about the old paintings. But we can go back to 3000 BC in Egyptian paintings, and we can see multiple perspectives creating one image. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about here. But also just working with my source imagery and working with a Picasso reference. One of my favorite teachers I ever had was this guy named Steve Sheehan in Connecticut, and he's actually a pretty well-known artist and teacher. He taught at Yale for a long time, and he edited that big book, The Artist Materials and Techniques Handbook by Ralph Mayer, which is kind of a Bible of materials for a lot of these old materials and stuff like that. But he told me, when we're painting, you should always have a book out when you're painting. And at first I was thinking, what does that even mean? You should have a book out? Am I supposed to be reading? What's, and what he meant was, of course, an art book. And he was like, everybody who comes in to paint, I don't care what book you bring in. I don't care how it relates to your painting. I just want you to bring in a book, open up the pages, and have that book open so you have a masterwork around you. And I think that sets an interesting benchmark. Of course, as you get more and more comfortable with what you're doing and with what you're making, you can find artists that are more pertinent to what you want to create, right? But I think it's good to just start off and just get a book. Sometimes I'll still do it. I have a pretty big library in my studio, which is now a school as well, in Prague. And sometimes I'll just open Matisse. Doesn't matter if I'm making a painting like Matisse or making a painting like Cézanne or whatever, making a painting like Picasso. You can just open up a book, have that book open, kind of have that presence open with you, flip through the pages occasionally, and just get a feel for those colors, get a feel for those compositions, because painting is not anything new. I know everybody wants to come into painting thinking they're unique and they have their own unique style and they're groundbreaking. But more likely than not, the way you make marks is based on ways that you're taught. So you want to kind of expand the way you look at the world and expand how you approach painting as well. And we always want to do things that are comfortable for us. And that's part of why we procrastinate as well. It's easier to sit on the couch and eat chips and watch. See, I don't watch a lot of these Netflix shows, but watch Netflix. For instance, I would like to sit on the couch, eat chips, and watch a documentary about jellyfish. For instance, I love underwater documentaries. I think I'm at the underwater documentary phase of these times that we're living in. For a while, I was watching rock tumbling videos. That was kind of strange, and I was like thinking, like, do I need to get a rock tumbler? Maybe I should get a rock tumbler. And then I was like looking into rock tumblers, and I was like, what? It takes like 2 weeks of them tumbling? But I suppose that'd be kind of fun too. You just set it and forget it in your basement and tumble rocks for 2 weeks and then see what comes out. Anyway, I've gone through different phases of watching different videos in these times. But getting back to procrastination, of course we want to do what's easiest for us in our brains. Always. We want to take the easy way because that's more comfortable. It's more painless in a way. And when we think about painting, we can kind of liken it to working out, I think. I don't go to the gym all the time. I'm not some sort of gym rat or anything like that. But I have gone on an occasion. I've done my time on the elliptical. And when you're, chugging away on the elliptical, at a certain point, you might start thinking, oh, I gotta stop, right? But you don't. And you just keep going. You got 3 more minutes in you. You don't need to stop. And painting's kind of like that too. Your brain gets tired. You're like, oh, I want to go and watch jellyfish documentaries. What am I doing here? Why am I trying to figure this out? It's not even working. Yeah, it's your brain telling you, you got to stop. This is hard. I want to do easy stuff. I want to be like a lion and lie on the ground and, eat a gazelle every once a week, maybe run around and catch a gazelle for, how long does that take? Probably not that long to catch a gazelle. So we want to do what's easiest for us. And sometimes having these books out on our tables, we can do things that push us outside of our comfort zone a little bit. That little voice in our head that always tells us to stop when we're on the elliptical. That little voice telling you, okay, you've had enough. You got to stop. You got to stop. No, you can keep going. And if you're painting along with me, just keep that in mind. You can keep going. You can paint with me for an hour or 90 minutes. You're going to be okay. You're going to survive it. And you're going to have something at the end. It's kind of like with Bob Ross. Everybody loves Bob Ross. I mean, I don't think I've ever met anybody who hated Bob Ross. I can't even think of that sentence existing. I hate Bob Ross. Of course not. Everybody has to love Bob Ross, even without having the pet squirrel that he found and fed since it was a baby, and then brought on his show and has had it sit on his shoulder. How can you not like the man? Anyway, what I'm saying is when you start painting along with somebody, you're just in it for the ride. So I would encourage people, maybe you're coming into the live stream late, and that's cool. Just watch along and listen. But come back to one of these videos and just paint along with me. And getting into the painting itself, essentially at this point, I wanted to force myself into a room type situation because I know I am prone to start thinking about portraiture as taking up the entire page, more or less, right? I think of a portrait should be as big as my head. And here I've got a piece of masonite, which is 30 centimeters by 40 centimeters. And I really wanted to push that portrait back in space a little bit and use the space differently and kind of fight that urge to just think about a portrait only taking up, the size of the canvas itself. So I pushed her back in space. I've got this kind of big blobby nose. Who knows? Maybe I'll change it as I go along. And you can see on the left-hand side, this is a super easy trick with any portrait. And Picasso's doing it all the time, but you can look at anybody. You can look at Ribera, you can look at Goya, you can look at anybody who you want that's making portraits, Hans Holbein. And you think about one side is dark, and on that dark side, you bring something light, and then you alternate that. So I'm just darkening up this background at this point, and because it's going to pop the space forward. And oftentimes in painting, we're thinking about pushing space back in space and pulling things forward in space. That's essentially what we're doing. We're taking the three-dimensional world, we're flattening it onto a two-dimensional surface, and we're playing around with illusion. And we can play around with illusion, with light, with form, with the way we understand the world. You know, if there's a light, if there's a candle, let's say there's a candle on a table, and the candle is nicely flickering on the table, and you've got a big bowl full of fruit on the table, and you've got all the lights on, or all the lights off in your house. You can imagine how that light is going to illuminate those forms. It's going to come from that light source. So we just think of that same sort of light source. It doesn't have to be exact. We're making a Picasso, right? But start off, I went straight with these diagonals into the corners of my masonite itself. And with those, that immediately creates this stuck in a room sort of image. It's almost like a Francis Bacon at this point. Feels kind of like a Francis Bacon in some ways. But I really wanted to push that figure back in space and have her sitting on a chair of some sort. So she's not just, we're not just looking at the features of her face. We're looking at an environment itself. And of course, we can also make certain compositional decisions. Now, the paint that I'm using for this is just cad red medium and a little bit of ivory black. And that's how I'm starting off here. I haven't really used any medium at all so far. I used a little bit of paint thinner when I first started out, just to thin my paint down, just to get in that initial sketch, to kind of set where stuff might be. But as I'm going along, I'm really just using nothing but oil paint and a little bit of linseed oil. Drying linseed oil is what I prefer because it dries a little bit faster. And you can just buy that. It's just called drying linseed oil. But that's all I'm going to use. Little bit, I just barely dab my paint into, or I barely dab my brush into my little shot glass of linseed oil. And I keep it pretty thick because you want it to be pretty thick because you don't want, stuff to be coming through the layers that you're putting down. When you put down a layer of black, you want it to be black. You want it to not be transparent. And I think oftentimes in starting off with painting, everybody thinks about transparencies because transparencies are a lot easier to deal with in some ways. They're not as big of a drastic change as when we put in an opaque color. So we want to start off with really, really thick paint, and we want to ensure that that thick paint really covers, and we do that by simply using more paint. I can't tell you how many times in teaching throughout years and years that I've taught hundreds and hundreds of students, I've had students come up to me and say, like, why isn't my painting working like yours? Why? Like, it doesn't seem as bright. It's not covering. It's just not what? And I'm like, you need to use more paint. They squirt out the paint onto their palette and they make this little bitty dot of paint because they think it's expensive, and it is expensive, but they don't, oftentimes when you start, you don't understand that you don't need that much paint. If you have cadmium, for instance, if you're using cadmium paints or titanium, you don't actually need that much paint in order to cover the surface because the paint is inherently opaque. So you want that paint to cover properly. You want to start off with opaque paints, and you don't want to mix it with too much paint thinner, except in that initial sketching phase. Even for this Picasso, we start off with a sketch. Everything, we want to bust in the main compositional elements first. Now what I'm doing here is these are some old bookmarks which I found in my studio. My studio used to be an antique shop, and they had all sorts of stuff. They had too much stuff, and I'm a hoarder. I think artists by nature are hoarders. So I've got all sorts of little bits and pieces of stuff where I'm thinking like, I can use that, and then sometimes I throw it away and I'm like, oh man, now I gotta buy it. It's like I'm losing money. But anyway, there was this pile of bookmarks that this antique shop had here, and they just left them here. So I use them as a way to make straight lines. I just plop it flat down onto the canvas itself and then paint around the edge with my brush. And on this side of the face, I'm just going to go a little bit lighter because, as I said before, it's real simple with portraits, light side and dark side, and you want the background of the light side to be darker and the background of the lighter side, background of the darker side to be lighter, right? So I'm kind of alternating in these sides here at this point where I'm thinking about, okay, I'm going to have a dark side, I'm going to have a light side, and these two sides are going to help us figure out the form because we're doing a Picasso. And that doesn't mean we can just do whatever we want, because if you want to engage in an interesting exercise about Picasso, right now just go to Google and Google out Picasso 14 years old. Try that. Or Picasso Communion. Look up Picasso Communion painting. I think he did that when he was like 14 or 15. And Picasso was a prodigy. And there's a lot of debate about what it means to be a prodigy. And usually, I would think it means that you can do stuff that adults can do when you're really, really little, and you're not supposed to be able to do them. And we see that with piano, we see that with violin, we see that with painting, drawing, we see it with science and math and all of these sorts of things. There are prodigies. And believe it or not, that is a controversial idea, to believe that prodigies still exist. A lot of art schools don't like the idea that prodigies exist. And of course, in the world we live today, we want everybody to believe that they can do it. And I think everybody can do it with enough practice. But for some, it just comes a lot easier early on. And Picasso was one of those people that it just simply came a lot easier for him when he was still very young. So if you look up the paintings of Communion, Google out Picasso Communion painting, and you'll immediately see that at 14, he was unbelievably skilled for his age. Now, a lot of naysayers are going to say, well, yeah, of course, but his father was a painter as well, and his uncle worked at the art school and all this sort of stuff. And that's true. A lot of geniuses put in an unbelievable amount of practice when they're still young, and who knows, maybe the space and time all converge and they create the perfect circumstances for somebody to be really, really good at math, or really, really good at painting, or really, really good at making music, or all these sorts of things, and it has nothing to do with genetics at all. I don't know. Regardless, he was super good when he was really young. If you can see that painting, you can see, like, this is not how a 14-year-old paints, okay? And obviously, he could do that early on. What I'm getting at with that is when we talk about painting and drawing, I think there's a few things. that we have to think of. One of them is just muscle memory. How do we move the brush that we're holding in our hands? What is the muscle memory associated with simply moving that brush in certain ways? And this just comes with practice. It's like people that are, making burritos, even. You see those videos of people like working at these street food stands and this sort of stuff, and they're just like wrapping burritos like crazy. And you're like, how are they? That's insane. That makes no sense. But they've made so many burritos throughout the years that they can just like automatically make a burrito. And that's the goal of a lot of drawing as well, is to just imprint that muscle memory in your head so you can just automatically create a painting, more or less. And you go on autopilot. It's the same way with music as well. When musicians will get so used to their instrument that they don't have to think about it. They don't think about, okay, A minor, then B, then where do we go? Oh, this is an E, I guess, here. They're just like bum, ba-da, bum, 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 bum. That's why they make it look effortless. We often hear that with painting and drawing and music as well. And it can be really annoying, right? It can be really annoying when people make effortless paintings and effortless drawings, but oftentimes that simply comes with a lot of practice. And what I'm getting at is Picasso had a ton of practice. He had a lot of practice, and he became quite good at a young age. So he was able to deconstruct a lot of the common academic ways of going about a painting that we would think about, but he still used a lot of these same principles that we see in academic painting, such as one side being darker, one side being lighter. With Picasso himself, you can think it's still a portrait, and that makes it already something completely different than an abstract painting. I don't know if Picasso has any abstract paintings, like fully abstract paintings. And I kind of love that about him, that it's always grounded in looking. And essentially what we're doing in painting always is looking and reacting. And the goal is to get so comfortable with oil paint, get so comfortable with paint itself, that we can create without thinking. And we do that by maintaining practice. It's like going to the gym every day for 30 minutes, 45 minutes. Doesn't have to be 4 hours. Doesn't have to be 6 hours. Just start off with 20 minutes a day, something like that. 30 minutes a day. 10 minutes a day would help in your sketchbook. And by doing so, you're gonna form habits. We want to start forming different habits, and our brain starts working in different ways. I'm currently in the process of teaching myself my left hand how to get better, just because sometimes my right hand literally just gets tired. So I want to have another hand. So I'm like trying to figure out with my left hand, and I'm realizing my left hand works in a really different way than my right hand does. But it just takes practice. I know how the light's supposed to go, but my muscle memory on my left hand is still clunky. It doesn't work. It's like signing your name with your left hand, and you're like, wow, man, right? So you want to get that muscle memory down, and you want to train your brain to be able to react to the paint, react to the situation, react to the composition. And so it is essentially something that is really an intuitive process. But through this intuition, you're also creating something that is set in stone, set in the fundamentals in some sort of way, because you've banged those fundamentals into your head. And that just comes from practice. The simplest thing I always ask students, first thing I ask them, first day of class, first, kind of getting to know you session, before you get into actually drawing and painting and these sort of things is, do you have a sketchbook? And the reason why I ask this is because a sketchbook is something that you can take with you anywhere. You can have a pencil in that sketchbook. It can be a little sketchbook. It can be a sketchbook the size of your bag. It can be a sketchbook the size of your purse. It can be a little miniature, stack of Post-it notes. I used to take pieces of paper and fold it into thirds. Just fold a piece of paper into thirds and then fold it into thirds again, and you get 9 little squares, right? So you fold it into thirds horizontally, fold it into thirds vertically, and you'll see, all those folds will create 9 different little squares. They're like 9 different little panels. And that can be, you can just fold it back and forth, and you got this little tiny area that you can make a drawing in. You don't even need to have a sketchbook to bring around. It could be something even that small. It's a third of the size, or it's a sixth. Wait, no, it's a ninth. It's a ninth the size of a piece of paper. So it's something you can just carry in your back pocket with a little pencil or something like that. But that's sort of constant practice, constant looking at the world, and just thinking about, okay, light stuff is here, dark stuff is here. Let's go at it. And then you're just figuring out proportions, figuring out size, all this sort of stuff. Now, I know at this point, this painting is, she's got this sort of bean on her head. And we'll see where it's headed. I'm still not quite sure. I'm trying to work out the composition to be as Picasso-esque as possible and make my own version. And I think it's important to create your own versions of these paintings when you're making them. You don't necessarily always have to make a painting that's just a copy. Master copies are a great practice, and they teach us a lot about painting too. That's another thing. If you're ever trying to figure out, how do I get better at painting? Look at the painter that you like and then make a painting like them, right? Copy it or make your own version. So let's say you like Picasso. Okay, you like Picasso's portraits of Dora Maar. Okay, that's what I'm doing right now. I like them. Okay, so get your own image of a person that you know, your own Dora Maar, so to speak, and with that image, make your own portrait in a Picasso-type way. But keep that book open. Take your computer, Google it out, leave your computer on the table where you're painting, and have a picture that you're kind of thinking about in the creation of your work. Because your brain's going to want to stray back to where you're comfortable. You're going to want to get comfortable in the way you've always painted for a million years. And the goal of these exercises and why I like doing them, I can't help but just keep doing Picassos. That's just, for me, Picasso portraits are like the funnest thing. They're so forgiving, but they're also like really difficult in a lot of ways, and you can mess them up, but you can always come back and bring them back and fix them and these sort of stuff as well. So when I'm creating these paintings, I want to have that image that I'm looking at of the Picasso image right in front of me as well, but not copying it, interpreting it. Oh, this is how he looked at a nose from this direction. This is how he looked at, these sort of things. So we just get a basic idea of how he approached a painting. Now, at this point, the other thing with Picasso, he's using a lot of big, bold areas of color. Oftentimes, if you want to check out a great documentary, you can check out a documentary called The Mystery of Picasso, or Picasso Mystery. You should be able to find it on YouTube. And essentially, it's just a documentary of Picasso painting. And he's got these sort of, they had to create some drama for the film, so they would create a timer where he had 60 minutes or something to make a painting, or 15 minutes to make a painting. And I'm sure that's because they wanted to create some sort of drama, but that's a fun thing to do as well, is literally just to time yourself. But one thing you'll notice in looking at this documentary of Picasso painting is that oftentimes he would erase everything he did. And that's okay too. As you're creating one of these paintings, you don't necessarily have to make everything right the first time. A painting can be an investigation. And it's important to think of a painting as an investigation. It's not necessarily the end-all and be-all where every single brush mark is the last brush mark that you put down on the canvas. That painting itself can be an investigation into looking and figuring out, how does this look, right? So you can look at the image from the side, you can look at the image from the front, you can look at the image from the back, all these sorts of areas, But essentially, at the end of the day, you can also not be afraid to erase stuff. Don't be afraid to mess up. It's why charcoal and vine charcoal is such a great medium to start off with, oftentimes with figure drawing and figure painting, because it's simply so easy to erase. You can just brush it off with your hand even. You can just brush the charcoal off of the page. And by doing so, you get a lot of chances to make that mark. Like, let's say you're trying to make a forearm or something like that. You don't have one chance. You have a bunch of chances. You can just erase it. It's no big deal. And that sort of freedom is a really important thing to try and cultivate, certainly when you're starting off painting. That sort of freedom is really important in the creation of your work, because then you're not scared to just jump right in and make a mistake. Oftentimes, Giacometti, if you don't know Giacometti, look him up. Giacometti. Look up Giacometti and look at how the portrait that he creates is really a search of sorts. It's a search for a painting. It's a search for form. And that's how I want you to start thinking about when you're creating your works as well, searching for those different forms. That's all I'm doing. It starts off with the sketch. It's the same way with representational painting. People think that Picasso is doing something strange and that he's doing something, completely different than everybody else. But in a lot of ways, it's still constructed in a really conservative, typical way of making a painting. It's constructed by starting off with an underpainting, which is simply thinning down your paint and sketching with it. And then you go from dark to light. Go to the dark colors, go to the light colors, right? It's the same thing you would do in representational painting. It's not that different. So when you're doing your own Picasso, I hope maybe somebody is painting along with me. If not, you can always replay the video after I'm done with this stream and make your own. But I would think even better than following along with me, you can take my lead, have me open, have Picasso open, and then have your source imagery open while you're painting. Maybe even set a timer. Give yourself a time limit of some sort. But just say, I'm going to sit in this chair for 90 minutes. I'm going to sit down here for 90 minutes, and I'm just going to keep painting, no matter what. It can go wrong, it can get wonky, but I'm just going to keep chugging along, and something's going to happen by the end. I'm going to end up with something, because that's the thing with painting. You actually end up with a thing at the end. It's not like practicing the violin, right? When you practice the violin, what do you end up with at the end of it? Something that hopefully you got better? I don't know. How do you gauge that the next day? You can't look at that thing. I guess you could record yourself. But with painting, you have a thing. You have an actual physical object, and you can come back the next day. And the kind of magical thing that happens sometimes is you can be sitting there staring at a painting for hours and hours and hours. You get tired, put it away, you go watch Netflix, fall asleep, come back the next day and you look at the painting and you're like, whoa, that nose is wrong. What was I thinking? What, So our eyes and our brains sometimes need a break, and then we can look at a painting again after a little bit of time. Give yourself that break and allow yourself to have a second go at a painting as well. But you can see that a lot of these things don't jump out to you at first. I think we get stuck in our own heads a lot of the times when we're creating work. So it's kind of like a kid, like a 5-year-old making a painting of a grasshopper and a helicopter. And they think this thing, that they're painting looks exactly like a grasshopper and a helicopter. And that's super cool, right? That's an awesome way to experience painting and the magic of it, I'm sure. But then they come back the next day, and anybody who's had kids knows that your children and their beautiful drawings they make at 6 or 4, by the time they're 9, all of a sudden they're like, oh, that was terrible. That was so bad. And it was like, no, that was really good. And they're like, no. And they think it's bad because they've been taught that other things are important by that age. They've seen people that can paint really realistically, right? Everybody wants to draw and paint realistically. I want this to look real, right? And so they've been programmed by their culture. If they were making Egyptian paintings in the pyramids in 3000 BC, they would have a totally different approach to painting itself, but more importantly, they would actually have a different approach to perceiving the world and seeing a painting. That's kind of an amazing thing, isn't it? Because now we're kind of stuck in this idea, I want it to look real. Picasso's not about real. Picasso did real when he was 13 years old. He did that. He started getting interested in other things. And so I would encourage all of you to also think about, how do I look at paintings? How do I look at drawings? What do I consider good? What do I think is a good painting? What's an example of a good painting? And then do that. Do your own version of that. If it's Picasso in 1932, try it. It's only a learning exercise. Like I said before, we're just pushing and pulling form in space on a 2-dimensional surface, and there's a lot of tricks we can use, some simple, some not so simple, in order to try and make this 2-dimensional surface look 3-dimensional. But just play around with it. It's a lot about being comfortable with your medium. I think if you're playing piano, one thing they say is, you should learn to sight read music, right? But more importantly, you should also just get comfortable with your piano itself. So think of this painting as your piano in a way, this paint, this medium. You're just getting comfortable with it. You want it to be something that you don't have to think about, you don't have to worry about too much. It's fun, it's enjoyable, and it becomes more and more effortless in a certain way. Perhaps you knew somebody in your life that was really good at playing the guitar, and they never went to a lesson in their life, but they sat on their couch and they watched TV and they just doodled around on the guitar. And then eventually maybe somebody was like, wow, you're really good at guitar. Do you want to play in my band? And they're like, I have no idea how to play in a band. I've just been sitting on my couch playing guitar. And then they're like, well, just come and play with us. And then they come, and the first time they may play with other people, they probably aren't that good. But then after they practice a few times, they start figuring out, oh, this is the dynamics of a band. This is a different thing now. They can get used to it. It's the same with painting, same with drawing, all these sorts of things. There are tricks, but the biggest trick is practice. Just practicing every day and continuing with it, which I'm sure everybody can do. So at this point, I'm just blocking in these shapes, and I want to keep this basically in the neutral gray territory. And one way you can do this is to simply start off with that cad red and ivory black for your dark color. And then you can see on my palette that I'm modulating up. And what I mean by modulating up, I'm just adding a little bit more white, adding a little bit more red. So it's really simple painting. It's all very muted. It's all very gray. And we're just pushing some stuff warmer, and we're pushing some stuff cooler. Essentially, all that means is some stuff is bluer, some stuff is redder. More or less, that's what it means. Can be a little bit more orange, could get a little bit more yellow if it's warm, could be a little bit more purple or blue. Some greens are a little bit cooler. But some greens, like an olive green, are a little bit warmer. Greens are a little goofy like that. But we're just slowly modulating these grays, making some grays warmer, making some grays cooler. And that's how I'm approaching this painting. Again, this is academic painting stuff. It's how we see the world. And it comes from Picasso as well. So we can think about all this, the Academy, and of course Picasso, I think he was born in 1881, if I'm not mistaken, and lived to 1973, I believe. But, 1881, that would have been the height of the French Academy, and what that was, the French Academy was a place where they literally said, this is how you paint. This is the right way to paint. Maybe that was something we need in art schools today. But they would say, this is how you paint. This is how you mix color. This is wrong. That toe looks terrible. That's not what a toe looks like. That's not what an eye looks like. This is how you paint an eye. Do it like this. And Picasso was born right at the height of that tradition in a certain way of painting, the Academy, as it's called. And obviously, at a certain point, he rebelled against that. But that way of painting was still imprinted on him in a lot of ways. So that way of creating paintings didn't just vanish. And a lot of these techniques were incorporated into how he continued to create works. And one simple way that he did that was color. How do you use color? Well, when you use color, when we see the world, contrary to popular belief, we see the world as neutral grays, essentially. And what I mean by that is that we oftentimes do not see bright, pure color. It's very, very rare that we see a bright, pure color. Most of the world is experienced as some sort of a neutral gray color itself. And that's what I'm going for in this painting as well. A lot of times when we look back at older paintings and we can even think, wow, that looks so old. You know why it looks old? Because they didn't consume digital media all day, where there was bright blues and bright purples and bright pinks and oranges and all these sorts of popping colors that we see all over the place in digital media, like now. And the paintings that people are making now correspond more to that world. And that's one reason why they have all these sorts of bright colors exploding out of the canvas. That's more of how we perceive the world today, is these sorts of colors. With Picasso, you literally did not have access to a bright red or a bright blue printed in media as the way we do today. So that also influences the way we perceive the world, and it's why we look back at these old paintings and we often think like, wow, that looks so old. The colors just look old. And, we might even trick our brains into thinking like, is it just old because, it's aged and those colors have got like muted over the years? Not really. A lot of it has to do with literally how they're approaching the world. So a good rule of thumb, if you're painting, is always, first of all, don't clean your brush too much. you can literally just keep your brush full of paint, and so when you're mixing a lot of different colors, wipe it off with a rag, but you don't necessarily have to, start, wipe it totally clean, and it's like, oh, I'm using blue now, I have to totally clean my brush and switch off. No, you can have a little bit of that blue residue left over in there. There's no problem with that. Leave a little bit of that blue residue in the brush and let it kind of sink into that orange. I know at first we're like, but when we plop that orange down, it actually works, right? So don't be afraid to use those sort of things in the creation of your painting itself. Now here again, I'm just using that bookmark to make my straight lines. My brain can sometimes just zone out when I'm working on some of these areas. And that's the difference between, the right side of our brain and the left side of our brain. Sometimes I'll be drawing and it's just like, burk. Word section no longer working. But that's a good thing to do as well. A lot of times when people are trying to figure out ideas for paintings and these sort of things, they're wondering, like, what can I do to come up with an idea for a painting? And I would approach it the same way. It's about that mindset. Getting into that mindset of painting itself is this really open flow mindset where you allow these different ideas to just kind of flop into your head in certain ways, right? So with painting, you want to create a situation where you can be painting and not worrying about painting. You're not worrying about the decisions you're making too much, but you're kind of going with the flow, I guess, as they say. And with writing, it can be the same way. With idea generation, it can be the same way. They even find this to work at different businesses and corporations and these sort of places where they talk about brainstorming. And don't worry about if an idea is bad. Just write down that idea regardless. I think that's a good way to approach painting too. If you're making a painting, don't worry about making the wrong mark. You can make the wrong mark. It's okay. You can paint over it. It's not the end of the world, right? So when you're creating these paintings, don't worry about getting everything totally perfect right at first. Hello, up and coming artists. So with painting, we want to create that space, and with writing, if anybody's heard of the morning pages, that's basically an exercise where you wake up in the morning and you just write for 10 minutes in the morning and don't think about what you're writing. Just get it out onto the page. You can do this at night too. It doesn't have to be in the morning. But it comes from this book, The Artist's Way, that kind of popularized it. But, you know, if you're stuck up on trying to create ideas, you can just get out a pen and paper when you wake up in the morning and just write for 10 minutes, regardless. Just keep that pen moving for 10 minutes and just keep writing words. Some of it's going to make no sense. Some of it's going to be nonsense. That's fine. Think about painting that same way. When you're creating those marks, you want to be confident, because we can see in the mark itself whether it's a confident mark or a not so confident mark, right? We can see that. One thing that's always confident, one mark usually that's very confident in most people, is their signature. So a good exercise in that respect can be that to just get a piece of paper and a pen, write your signature on it, and look at the confidence of that line in that signature. And then compare that line, the actual way the line looks, and compare that with a line in your drawing. And you might see that certain areas of your drawing actually look less certain than other areas. Maybe you're really good at drawing eyes, but you're not so good at drawing, noses or something like that. And you can see, our brains can see this, of course, that the nose looks less confident than the eyes. So we want to just keep that confidence, even when it doesn't exist. It's kind of a fake it till you make it sort of approach to painting and drawing in this respect, where you're really essentially just painting and you're continuing on whether you like to or not, right? And thanks, up and coming. So when you're making these paintings and drawings, just keep that confidence. Even if you don't feel confident, keep that pen moving. Think about it like you're in the gym working out. You're on the elliptical machine. You got 5 more minutes, right? You got 5 more minutes. You can do 5 minutes. You can do 5 minutes of painting. If you can do 30 minutes on an elliptical, you can do 20 minutes of painting. It's not going to hurt you. And what's the worst that can happen? The painting's not good? Oh, that's terrible. Right? So just keep on keeping on no matter what, and get in the habit of making those marks, making those paintings, whether you want to or not. And with time, it's going to inch along, every day. It's going to be kind of like the tortoise and the hare sort of situation. That's why a lot of times people say painting is a marathon. It takes your entire life, right? And you'll notice that every single day you might not notice it every single day actually, but you'll notice it over the course of months. It's a slower growth than a lot of different things. But we've all seen these videos of people that want to learn how to roller skate or want to learn how to dance or something in 1 year, and they start off and they categorize their work from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, right? And one of the great exercises I had in 7th grade, I still remember, was the instructor just set up a still life in the middle of the room on the first day of class, and then he took a photograph of that still life, and it was all these different still life things like cans and roller skates and a sculpture of some sort and a pot and a coffee cup and all this sort of stuff. But just set up a still life. You can do this on your own as well. Just set up a still life, photograph it, and then 6 months later, set up that still life in the exact same way and try to do it again. Don't look at that drawing that you made 6 months ago. When you do that first drawing, just do it and forget it. It doesn't have to be 6 months. It can be 1 month or 2 months or whatever. But just make that first drawing and put it away. Don't look at it. 6 months later, come back to that same still life, make another drawing of that same still life, and then go back to that original drawing and put your first drawing and your second drawing next to each other. And I'll bet you that there'll probably be some improvement in that time from that first drawing to that second drawing. And like I said, you probably might not even, you might still think it's bad because we always want to be critical. We're the most critical of ourselves. We got to get over being critical. Other people don't care. Most other people do not care. They don't care nearly as much as we like to think they care. So get over that and be critical of yourself, but be critical of yourself in a positive way and set yourself up for a situation where you can see that improvement and you can see that you're actually getting better and better. So I think that's a really, really important thing to think about, is creating a situation where we can see where we need to improve our skills, like Up and Coming is stating as well in the comments. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to write me comments and questions in the chat. I'm not checking it constantly, but intermittently I glance over at it too. So if you have any questions, just write them down in the chat area. But one thing we can think about, in art schools today is that usually there isn't that right way. And perhaps that's something that we've lost throughout time, is this idea of creating a painting in the right way. I think we can kind of universally agree that the Academy in 1870 in France, for instance, that's not the only way to paint, but that was one way to paint. Picasso obviously did not paint like that, but that is one way to paint. And when you're a student, I think there's a benefit to being able to acknowledge that this is the right way to paint, or this is not the right way to paint, right? And since we live in a time where there's all these different types of ways to paint, we can also think about, what is the right way I want to paint? And you do that by finding the artist that resonates with you the most. Find that artist. Doesn't mean you have to copy them. A lot of times artists have very strange artists that they're looking at that you would never guess. So it can be an artist that resonates with you for a variety of reasons. It could be the conceptual matter that they're working with. Maybe they're working with certain concepts, certain ideas. Maybe they're painting certain subjects. This is just a portrait. You can think about painting just portraits, right? This can just be a portrait. It doesn't need to be anything more than a portrait. Just a portrait of a person sitting in a chair. Doesn't have to have some huge idea, but it could. And if you are one of those people that wants these sort of big ideas, then you can go to those types of artists. Find them. Get the book. Go to the library. Check out the book that they have. If they don't have the book, suggest to your librarian, hey, it'd be great. I love Jim Shaw, who is a painter. Do you know about Jim Shaw? He's a really great painter, and tell your librarian this. And I think it would be really beneficial to this community to have a Jim Shaw book. And a lot of these libraries, they have a budget every year, and they'll listen to people that come in and say, maybe you should have this. They want to hear it. Of course, you can buy the book as well. If you got money for it, that's always good too. But like I said, open up that book, look at that artist, and you're emulating a certain way of thinking about painting, but you're also looking at how they perceive the world. And maybe the way you perceive the world now is different than the world that they existed in. So it's going to be harder for your eyes to get around that old way of seeing the world because they were different people then. We were different people in 1880 than we are today. So paintings are going to look different as well. So for these walls, I'm just got some cad yellow that I've dirtied up with some little bit of red and some of that black and red mixture that I made a pile of. And I'm mixing that into it just to soften it. Because once again, we want to think about all these colors as being grays of some sort. They're all neutral grays, right? And when we're creating these paintings, we're just slightly modulating these grays, lighter and darker, warmer and cooler. If you want, you can even just use black and white. They're two of the cheapest colors you can buy as well. So you shouldn't be able to complain about not being able to use enough paint. But just get, ivory black, titanium white, and you can do a ton with just black and white. In fact, in a lot of academies, that's how you'd actually have to just start off, was just painting with black and white paint in the beginning. You do that for a year maybe before you'd go on to color. So if you're struggling with trying to figure out a lot of the colors, I do this in my classes all the time as well with students that they acknowledge and articulate that they're having trouble with color and I just can't get this orange right, I don't get it. And I'm like, okay, maybe just do it in black and white first. And a really good trick as well that you can do while you're painting, if you are trying to do paintings in color, is while you're painting, take a photo of your painting that you're making on your phone and then switch that photo to black and white on your phone. And you're going to be able to see your darks and your lights of your yellows and your oranges and all these sorts of things. And if those are off in that black and white painting, or in that black and white photo of your painting, they're off in the painting too. So that means that orange needs to be darker. And a lot of times we think like, oh, orange, like if a bird has an orange beak, that should just be orange, right? Well, not necessarily. The bottom of the beak might be kind of like a browny orange, might be a darker orange. You can't just put an orange there and think like orange means beak. Think about the color itself. Think about the value that is there. And a lot of this stuff breaks down when you take that black and white image. I do that in my classes all the time, where I just have the students take their phones out. Okay, everybody, take a photo of your painting. Let's look at the images. And a lot of times they're like, oh man, I thought I was making the shadow of the eye, but there is no shadow of the eye. I modulated the color a little bit, but I didn't change the value. It's not darker. It doesn't feel like a shadow. It's because that black and white structure simply isn't present underneath it. So we can just think about hue. Hue essentially just means color. Intensity. Intensity is the brightness or softness of a color. This is a very low intensity painting. As I've stated before, it's a grayer painting. I'm not concerned with dark or bright reds, bright blues, and these sort of things. I want all the colors to kind of exist in this gray middle ground and slightly modulate them back and forth between warm colors and cool colors. But coming back to the things, we can think of hue, that means color. We can think of intensity, that means the brightness of that color. And then we can think of value, which means the darkness or the lightness of that color. Some colors are darker, some colors are lighter. That's it. For a lot of different types of paintings. Can be abstract paintings, can be, representational paintings. When we see color, we want to think of it as value, as darkness. That's right, up and coming. It is like a study of these colors and what colors are darker, what colors are lighter. And oftentimes we think, okay, I have red. This red is the red, right? This is my red. This is the red I have to use. Not necessarily. You can add more white to that red, obviously, to make it lighter. But you can add green to that red to make it darker. So we always go opposite the color wheel if we want to make it darker. If we want to make a yellow darker, we add violet to it. If we want to make an orange darker, we add blue to it. So it might seem a little strange at first, but you're essentially just adding the colors opposite the color wheel and modulating that color and making it darker. But in doing so, you're also taking down the intensity of that color as well. And that's something that I'm playing around with in this painting. As you can see, the bright white background that I've got, I actually painted over an old painting that I was kind of sick of and put that background in. And I'm really using not that much paint, but I'm barely using any linseed oil to thin it down. I want that paint to cover when I'm painting it. I mainly just want it to cover that surface. And I want all these colors, as you can see, these colors kind of, as we would say, go together. And that's another thing when people are asking, what does it mean? How do I make colors go together? How do I make them work together? And in this painting, they're all rather gray. Some people might think it's actually kind of drab. But Picasso's paintings that he made at that time were also often done with these really subdued colors. Most of the paintings that were made at that time were using fairly subdued colors, with the exception of the Fauvists, of course, who went through a period, Matisse, when they would, use these extremely bright colors. And Fauvist would actually mean wild beast, because they were their colors were so bright. But most of the Picasso paintings, the reason why they look kind of like academic paintings in a way is the color choices. And you can simply make these color choices by, like I said previously, just keeping that color on your brush. Don't be so meticulous and worried about always cleaning your brush. You don't want stuff to get muddy. You don't want all your colors to just become, muddy and all the same level of brownness. You want to make sure that some colors feel warm and some colors feel cool, right? But essentially, you always want to have a little bit of, muck left in your brush. That's just a simple way to do it. Just leave a little bit left over in your brush, and it'll all be okay. And your colors will go, as they say. Your colors will go together better if you just leave a little bit left over. Of course, in the creation of this painting, I'm also thinking about the composition itself. Here the figure is pretty much smack in the center of the composition, which Picasso did quite a bit in a lot of his portraits. He would, smack the person right in the center of the painting. And when we're making the lines, like the lines on the chair, for instance, we can, plop these lines in. And that's another thing to think about, is that we can always cut these lines back with our other colors. So at first we might put down a thick line. This is all oil paint too, by the way, so it's all still wet. But as we go along, we can kind of cut these shapes and make them smaller as we go, as we paint. And that's a really important concept to get your head around, is that when you plop down a line, when you plop down a shape, you can always change that shape as you go by simply painting another shape on top of it that's bigger. to alter it. So as we chug along on this one, we're also slightly modulating those shapes, and we can think about, things like composition. But I think a really fun thing to do is, try to, in this painting at least, I want to get a painting with some arms, arm-like things, and it's like what they call a bust of a person, right? So it's essentially their chest and their head as well. And you'll also notice that some of the main elements are blocked in at a third of the way down, not halfway down the composition, but we're thinking about a third, and a third, top third, middle third, and the bottom third. And this is a really, really simple way of composing paintings that's been around forever as well. It's called the rule of thirds. So we don't want, if our figure is right in the center of the painting from a vertical perspective, right? Our figure is smack in the center here. We even have these diagonals coming out to the edges of our painting as well. We want to break up that canvas into thirds on top of that to give it more variety and some more stability. And, like I was saying before, these types of Picasso, this is my third Picasso painting-like video that I've done so far. And Picasso's just really an interesting character in these regards because he's somebody who had all these different periods and styles. I hate that word style. Throughout the years, different approaches, we'll call it, instead of style. Maybe somebody's thinking, why doesn't he like the word style? When I think of style, I think of something that's kind of gimmicky. It might feel a little bit more gimmicky. So with Picasso, I feel like it is an approach. It's a way of seeing, if that makes sense. So try and, get around the way you think that you're seeing the world, and that will also help you in how you're going to be painting the world too, and how those two things are linked. Now you might be thinking, did Picasso see the world as, this woman with her nose sideways on her head and this little bean on her head? And, did he actually see the world like this? No, not necessarily. But seeing the world can also be thinking about what we're pushing back in space and what we're pushing forward in space. So when you look at her left arm, which is on the right side of the painting, when you look at the left arm, her left arm, you can see not only by the way it's positioned that it's kind of being pushed back in space, and her right arm is kind of coming forward in front of her, but also the color, just that slight modulation of that yellow ochre color, that's kind of helping push that other arm a little bit forward in space too. So we're thinking about pushing stuff back with that gray, pulling it forward with that warmth. And that's a really, really common thing with warm colors and cool colors, is simply that the cool colors are going to recede in space and the warmer colors are going to come a little bit forward in space a little bit more as well. So we can see that these two different colors react in very, very different ways. If we put down a red and we put down a blue right beside it on the same piece of canvas or whatever we're painting on, we're going to see that blue is going to feel like it's going back in space, and that red is going to feel like it's going to be coming forward in space a little bit more. It's just an illusion. And painting is an illusion. Once again, you're looking at it on a two-dimensional surface. We often don't think about it even when we're watching movies, unless we're, have 3D glasses on or something like that. But when we go to a movie, or when we watch a movie on our TV, that's still just a two-dimensional surface. And sometimes when we're taking shots for our films and these sort of things, There's all sorts of engineers and lighting people that have to accentuate the way the real world works. The real world is not enough for us to understand it on a two-dimensional surface. That's what photography is a lot of the times. It's getting those right light conditions to make it seem like stuff is coming forward, stuff is going back. You know, I can't tell you the amount of times I've had students in my classes where they're copying a photo and I simply have to tell them that's not a good photo to copy from, because that photo is not a good view of the world. First of all, your computer or your phone, most likely, that's taking the photo, is trying to make it better. So it's doing stuff. It's already trying to be smart. It's trying to put stuff in certain places, and it's changing stuff. It might even be blurring out the background a little bit to imitate our eye in the way our eye focuses, right? So the camera on your phone, even if you got the newest, best phone, is a problem because that's the way your phone sees. It's not the way your eye sees. And when we're painting, we want to think about the way our eye sees itself, right? So that's what I'm doing when I'm trying to teach often. No matter what it is that I'm teaching, I try to think about what is our eye actually seeing. And incidentally, if you see at the bottom left there, that I have that website, oko.academy, which I encourage you to check out, where I'm doing artist mentorship programs, working individually with painters, simply to do just that at the academy and teach people how to see and how to paint. I hope you've enjoyed this painting like Picasso portrait, and I encourage you to like and subscribe these videos and paint along with me. I got to let this dry. We're going to do a part 2 at a separate point, but I need to let this part dry now, and we'll come back with part 2 later on. But if you stuck with me for this video, thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.